That was a woman I was talking to. So, she had a very low voice. Probably a smoker. So.
This guy and this guy are two dramatically different characters. For about 6 seasons of Steve Carell's tenure on The Office, Michael Scott is a near completely static character. He evolves, but very slowly. He grows in the very little ways Michael Scott does. But for one single season, Michael Scott was someone very different. The US version of The Office was developed by Greg Daniels as an extension of the 12-episode British miniseries starring Ricky Gervais as David Brent, a hilariously mean-spirited, depressed, nearly functionless human being whose world was built around dark humor with a splash of the early makings of cringe humor. The first season of the US Office's 6-episode run attempted to recreate that edge, that very same angle, and the show was almost immediately cancelled. Paul Feig would say later in an interview that it was a miracle the show wasn't removed from air and that the support of NBC exec Kevin Riley is the only thing that saved it. Why? Because they f***ed Michael Scott.
That's what she said.
That's my joke.
Michael Scott in season 1 had to be changed in 4 visible and important ways to ensure the show's survival, and some of these changes are more obvious than others. If you had a hard time getting into The Office, well, these may very well be the reasons why. Michael was originally a totally unlikable, unoriginal caricature, and it was only once this was acknowledged by the show's writers and creator that it began to change. Maybe unsurprisingly, it starts with the superficialities of Michael Scott. You might have noticed that this Michael doesn't look exactly like this one. And that's because, well, first impressions in television are everything for a character, and Michael looked like a skeevy cartoon car salesman. It wasn't working. They slicked Carell's hair back in season 1 to give him a balding look. They dressed him in oversized clothing and left the blazer at home, tightened his collar up to give him the appearance of being slightly overweight and having a double chin, and gelled his scalp until the shine could be seen off the top of his head 3 shots away. This was all in an attempt to make him look like a more nefarious, more mean-spirited character, almost like a villain. The show's producers acknowledged this was not going to work for the character long-term if they wanted audiences to care about him. So, Season 2 introduced the new and improved, apparently Rogaine-using Michael Scott. More presentable, better dressed, less offensive in appearance. But this was just the surface. Where the real changes were made were in how moments like these are handled.
Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my...
This is the end of the Season 1 episode Diversity Day, maybe the show's most famous episode. There is no redemption here for Michael Scott. The moral of the episode, by the time it ends, is that he's awful, and that's that. The only moment of audience redemption comes here between Jim and Pam. It was a mean-spirited way to end an episode of a television show, and this approach apparently left a sour taste in the mouths of audiences, and their view of both the show and Michael's character was that of bleakness. The dark British humor not translating well to American audiences wasn't necessarily the issue. It was that the producers wanted the show to be on air for far longer than 12 episodes, and were too closely trying to replicate Brent and pursue that reality. Here's the end of the final episode of that first season, Hot Girl.
I probably should have told you I don't need a ride now because Jim can take me home after, so you're off the hook.
Okay, great. Off the hook.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
I got this.
All right, have fun.
Thank
Don't
you.
drink and drive.
A conscious decision was made from here on out, this very moment, to give the show's episodes more optimistic endings than this. To provide the audience with happier moments and give Michael an aura of humanity, whereas the UK Office ends with Brent's literal firing and his lowest point, from here on, Michael would end each episode happier. The aforementioned Paul Feig, former writer on the show, points to this moment in the Season 2 episode Office Olympics with being the aha moment of that optimism, stating that these were the moments that would make Michael Scott human, and the good feelings that would keep audiences around for more than 12 episodes. They leave their couches with a smile. So from Season 2 on, more optimistic endings were in. But there was a bigger glaring issue that producers believed had to be causing the show's poor reception throughout that initial season. Michael was not the world's best boss. In fact, it was entirely unbelievable to audiences that he even continued to have and keep his job. In the context of a mockumentary, the entire purpose of the format becomes believability in the gimmick. Therefore, if audiences don't believe in Michael's ability to run the office, they'll check out of the concept and in turn the show altogether. And I think this moment in the season 2 episode, The Client, is a direct response to that criticism.
Well, corporate's gonna go ballistic, but you think we could, Jan?
See, season 1 Michael, throughout all of his mean-spirited fake firings and offensive attacks on nearly everyone in the office, also fails to accomplish, well, essentially anything. In The Client, on the other hand, Michael continues to be Michael. He interrupts the meeting to call Pam to feed him a joke, he brings up Jan's split from her husband repeatedly, and he derails conversation for what seems to be hours.
Baby back ribs.
And then, he closes. He accomplishes something, a trend we'd see carried forth throughout the years post-season 1, as Michael flails around in sheer chaos, while somehow still getting the job done. This post-season 1 approach is why you see characters like David Wallace bring Michael in for tips on how to run the other branches. It's why you see Michael semi-successfully lead a competing paper company. Michael's momentary competence gives the show's writers the leverage and the space to encourage Michael's more ridiculous behavior. If he was doing this in the office and failing at his job, he'd become near instantly unlikable, because we the audience like Pam and Jim and Stanley, and we know branches are closing, and we as the viewer want that branch to succeed for their sake. If Michael was consistently playing with their livelihoods, we the viewer would grow tired of him. We'd resent him, he'd become a villain. So, Greg Daniels told his writers that from season 2 on, Michael had to be a more competent boss.
Thank you, Michael.
And it worked out. But I think the most important changes to Michael Scott made between season 1 and 2 are the changes that gave him a true character arc and stimulated his development as the most likable idiot in television history. This was the result of 2 decisions, and the first was more of a logistical choice. Michael Schur, former writer on the show, has spoken about it time and again. 10% was the idea. The show's cast would be 10% nicer to him after season 1, because this, all the time, wasn't going to work. And this was a sort of intangible change that happened slowly over time, but it was integral in shifting the audience's disposition towards Michael. If the characters we are attached to, the Jims and Pams, absolutely resent him, we are far less likely as viewers to change our opinion of him. So the 10% rule was put in place, but what really humanized him was the show's approach to relationships. In the first season, we only see Michael the boss. And the second season makes a concerted effort to give Michael relationships that he can grow around. Now, Jan and Michael's relationship is obviously just sad. It's one-sided, it victimizes Michael in a way that makes us feel for him, but it gives him little to no reason to develop as a character. Jan is, surprisingly, an even worse influence on Michael than he is on himself. Instead, it's Holly Flax, who doesn't arrive until season 4, that sparks the most character growth in Michael, and best represents that 10% motto.
I'm MC Max Scott, and I am hot. She's DJ Jazzy Flax, and she is the best.
Ironically and obviously, with her replacing Michael's foil in Toby. Holly shows us the audience that Michael can be loved and should be loved. Holly gave Michael a reason to mature, a reason to not read her unsent email to him, a reason to remove the toxicity from his life, a reason for him to be more comfortable and secure with himself. When we see a non-assuming, likable character like Holly fall for someone like Michael, we subconsciously view him as a more likable presence. And this is maybe the most dramatic change from season 1. In that season, Michael develops very little. He has very little to live for, and the attitude of those around him represents that. But there's a reason season 1 Michael, from his looks to the way his day ends to how he's treated and treats others, never makes it past those initial 6 episodes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He's ruined. He's butchering it.
I think part of the reason I find this also interesting enough at least to expound upon something I've already touched on, is because there's a widely held belief that the original 12-episode run of the UK Office is dramatically better than what the Steve Carell version offered. But I think if you look at both series in their totality, they are 2 very different versions of what it means to be the world's best boss. What Michael Scott accomplished was a transformation from something that everyone thought he should be, a David Brent, into something that was uniquely, well, Michael Scott. And I think that's the most important takeaway from the first couple seasons of the show. Sometimes it's better to be unique. It's better to be something different than it is to try and fit into a mold you'll never quite be able to squeeze into as well as someone else. So maybe stop trying to be them. It took Michael Scott a few episodes, but he just might be proof that the best way to be a success, to be the world's best boss, is to get a little bit of Rogaine and be yourself. And yeah, you're probably gonna need a little bit of luck.
I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious.
The Office is maybe the best example of a premise that is incredibly hard to pull off. The mockumentary. A genre with roots that have grown since the early 1960s, a mockumentary is a piece of entertainment that uses the pretense of a documentary to satirize the subject of the piece. Essentially, it's a fake documentary. You have mockumentaries like 1964's A Hard Day's Night. That was the first feature-length mockumentary that faked the lives of the Beatles over the course of 7 days. There's the vampire comedy What We Do in the Shadows, but these are films. They're a couple hours of narrative that lend themselves well to the immersion of the idea. It's very easy to believe in the documentary premise if you only have to do so for one sitting. The 2005 version of The Office gave a Michael Scott finger to what it meant to be a mockumentary and instead created around a set of principles or rules that the show would follow for nearly a decade. These were the rules of The Office. In order to make a good non-autobiographical documentary, the camera crew themselves should not detract from the subject or make themselves a recognizable presence at all. At least that's the traditional train of thought. Greg Daniels, co-creator and executive producer of The Office, did not take well to that idea. Rule 1 of The Office is that the camera crew are people too. Daniels once told Rolling Stone his goal was to direct the camera operators as if they were actors, since they were really in the scene as well. For instance, instead of saying start wide and then pan left and push in, he might say, "You know that Jan is jealous of Pam, so look for evidence of that, and make sure to check in on Dwight's weird date." He allowed the camera operators to take liberties, to act as though they were really in these situations and respond accordingly. Sometimes he'd even ask cameramen to close their eyes, spin around, and find the scene after. Now in theory, this could remove you from the show. It could add a weird, disjointing quality to the viewing experience and make you feel as though you're watching something that's less than organized. But the payoff ends up being the opposite almost in totality. The show's main cinematographer, Matt Sohn, was hired for his reality TV background, having just come off of shooting Survivor, and his experience gives The Office that unscripted feel. Knowing what to do with cameras in reality situations, it allows for moments like this.
Surprise! It's a joke. We were joking around. See? Okay, he was in on it. He was my accomplice, and there was just kind of a morale booster thing.
Where in traditional TV that dialogue spoken by Michael would have been caught on camera, here the camera stays on Pam, on the awkwardness and the anger, because one person, one camera, can only catch what matters to their eye. Using this principle, cameras will peek through blinds, follow cars, hide from sight, and this puts you in the shoes of someone who's really there. You're in the office because the camera is behaving like you would. This kind of engagement is something that's rarely implemented as well as it is here. But with this, you have to want to be there. Rule number 2 of The Office is that the subject has to be likable. Well, relatively. The original British version of The Office featured Ricky Gervais at his absolute driest and most unlikable, and it worked for a 12-episode miniseries, but this unlikability is simply not sustainable for much longer than that. The American Office came to the same conclusions shortly after almost seeing cancellation towards the end of season 1. Michael Scott was so unlikable that at times the show was genuinely hard to watch for those not looking for darker humor, something that's proven to be less palatable to American television audiences. Ken Tucker wrote in 2011 that from the start, Ferrell had to reinterpret Michael Scott as someone who could survive over the long haul. He couldn't be as petty or self-destructive as Gervais' creation had been. Gervais' boss was a short-fused time bomb, whereas Ferrell had to go more stealth. So, they made 3 changes heading into the second season. Most episodes would end with Michael being optimistic, he would be better at his job, and people would be slightly nicer to him. These changes allow you to maintain an interest in what could have otherwise been a mean-spirited and wholly disconnected character. Michael Scott had to be likable, and these changes went a long way to accomplishing that. But how do you deal with the rest of the personalities? Rule number 3, do not use talking heads as crutches. Exposition dumps, especially character exposition dumps, are almost never a good thing. There are ways to show information, to show personality, to understand a character without dumps of dialogue or narration that serve only that singular purpose. The Office relies heavily on talking head interviews, those moments where they're alone, often in the conference room talking to the camera, verbalizing their thoughts. These confessional moments very well could have been a hindrance on the show, but they're often used well enough that they become integral to the narrative. Take this scene.
And if he never comes back again, that's okay. We're friends. But you know what? It's okay. I'm totally fine. Everything is gonna be totally fine.
Are you free for dinner tonight?
Yes.
All right. Then it's a date.
Here we get a bit of everything. We see Pam as a real person because we see her sit here and lie to her interviewer, mask her true feelings like any real person would, and we see this confessional moment as a moment of humanity. We don't get her inner thoughts, we only get what she wishes to tell us. But yet the information is still given like it would be given traditionally in other formats, without words, in her expression, in her mannerisms. Then we see that confessional interrupted for one of the most important moments in the show's history. We get the feel that these confessionals are a normal part of their everyday. They're all aware of them and have normalized them, and the Office still functions around them. Sometimes nothing is said in these moments, sometimes it's just used for a punchline, but the talking head moments are not crutches for the writing, they're tools. Tools that help facilitate what is, in my opinion, the most important principle and rule the Office seems to follow throughout its tenure. The show's greatest mockumentary principle, what really makes it such a great example of the mockumentary, is the way it uses its technical premise to bring you closer to the stories within. The Office is constantly using the camera crew to fill you, the viewer, in on things that only you know. And unlike a normal serialized show, the characters know you know, and they treat you, the conduit that the camera crew represents, differently as a result. For a while, only you know about Dwight's affair with Angela, and Dwight knows this and behaves differently in the Office and to you, the cameras, in turn. Only you know the nature of Michael's relationship with Jan, and Jan's behavior shifts with that reality. Unlike so many other shows or pieces of entertainment, this principle that the Office employs brings you a much greater sense of attachment to these characters, because you feel as though you and them share these moments exclusively, this information, these stories. It's something very unique to the mockumentary style. It leads to payoffs like only you knowing about Jim and Pam's first kiss for so long, while the rest of the Office is clueless. You're alone in knowing when they first get together, how Jim and Pam really get married when Pam's pregnant. The Office deploys this technique to manipulate your attachment to these characters and their stories, and it works beautifully. The Office was not an infallible show. It had its faults, it tapered off in quality after Steve Carell's exit, but over the course of 9 seasons, The Office took a simple premise and nearly perfected it. It took one of the worst testing pilots in network history and turned it into an institution. It never veered off the course it set itself upon, and it did so by staying true to the idea that built its foundation. In a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania, there was a bland office in a nondescript business complex. There's no smaller setting than that. That office filled with dysfunctional relationships, sociopaths, jingle writers, all being documented every day, and it works so well thanks to the rules of the Office and the world's greatest boss. There have been and will be plenty of shows that attempt to follow in these footsteps, but replicating that path, that is an undertaking that will be even harder than you can imagine.
That's what she said?
This Andy Bernard is insufferable. Intentionally, he is pompous, an agitator, and plays as the villain to Jim's laid-back likability in ways that Dwight at times sympathetically doesn't. He punches this hole through this wall, and this was kind of supposed to be it. The end of Andy Bernard, the last time we saw him in the end of the merger saga that saw bodies drop in Scranton. Or almost drop.
Andy Bernard, regional director in charge of sales.
Andy Bernard was set to finish his short time on the show and move on to greener pastures, but something changed. Well, more specifically, the writers changed their minds. But there was one problem. This Andy Bernard was so bad, so unlikable that they couldn't possibly keep him on the show any longer. I wrote a while back about why The Office changed Michael Scott's character so dramatically after season 1. This is a much different story. This is the kind of strange story of how one show intentionally created one of the most unlikable characters on television and then undertook the chore of having to fix him in a single episode and then make it stick.
I'm gonna kill you for real. The game is over. I'm really going to shoot you.
Once upon a time, Ed Helms signed a deal with the studio producing The Office. So one day, showrunner Greg Daniels was asked to take a meeting with Ed as a studio formality. At least that's how the reports put it. It went well. They talked about their families, lives, the normal, someone else set this meeting up, banter. But eventually, they developed the idea for a character. This character would be a loud, raucous, brazen character, a gnat, whose sole purpose for existing was to be the butt of the joke and make sure we knew he didn't get it. To create disastrous situations and tense environments, he was literally envisioned as an annoyance. Better yet, as the annoyance. And quickly, Greg Daniels found a place for that annoyance, and it was a success. Andy Bernard was introduced to The Office as Jim's new Dwight in Stanford, when Jim would leave Scranton to run from his feelings for Pam. But where Dwight was a sometimes restrained and ridiculous equal, Andy was an under-medicated chihuahua just waiting to explode in a flurry of a cappella barks.
Newsflash! It's not funny! In fact, it's pretty freaking unfunny!
He never had an off switch. Whereas Dwight chose his moments of chaos, Andy was chaos. It worked because he was meant to only exist for a few episodes, like the original David Brent or even the first version of Michael Scott. He could be annoying, brash, he could and did make every viewer despise him. Every moment of brown-nosing, singing, and lack of self-awareness combined with a swelling and obvious rage made him the villain nobody wanted but could laugh at, instead of with. And maybe worse yet, he was the foil to the way people viewed Jim. Where the viewer is meant to find Jim's passive and sometimes dry charm and awkwardness endearing, Andy sliced through that with searing precision.
Why did you do that?
Making Jim at times feel like an outsider, as oafish. There was nothing redeeming about Andy. He even manages to make Dwight look good after encouraging Michael to fire him. And so when he finally snaps, and he punches this wall to create this hole, you, the viewer, feel a sense of relief. The payoff of dealing with this character for half a season, The Office, and you, the viewer, finally give Andy the comeuppance that he deserves. You're cheering for Andy's demise. It's actually one of the best moments from that season, but that unbridled, uncomfortable rage leads to a moment that, from a character perspective, kind of has to be a sign-off of sorts. You created a monster, a character meant to be hated. You made us hate him, and then you pushed him to breaking, and exposed a side of him that's somehow worse than anything he had shown before. And that could have been it. But there was a problem. The writers of the show all agreed on one thing. They loved writing for Andy Bernard. Greg Daniels would state that Ed was a great improviser. Such a great improviser that they simply couldn't let him go. So now, they were in a conundrum. They just created this character that was so unlikable that they literally decided to run him into the ground, and now they wanted to bring him back?
Sorry I annoyed you with my friendship.
When something like this happens, two things are in play. For viewers, Andy was a fun, short diversion. So the second thing is Greg Daniels and the writers now had the task of entirely overhauling Andy's character to make him not just tolerable long-term, but likable. But they also had to explain in a believable way how and why Andy Bernard changed so dramatically, seemingly overnight. So they devised a plan. Over the course of a single episode, they would change Andy and reintroduce him in 23 minutes as an entirely new version of himself. The episode was called Safety Training.
I graduated from anger management the same way I graduated from Cornell. On time.
In Safety Training, Andy returns to the office after completing his anger management course. That anger management course changes who Andy is, and the office reintroduces him as a somewhat reformed character, so much so that they symbolically offer Andy an entirely new name.
Drew. I'm Drew now.
This seems small, but it's also a showing of just how dramatically Andy's persona shifted. Andy states that he now has a new lease on life when it comes to dealing with his anger and how he treats other people. But I think the genius of this episode actually lies in what doesn't happen. In almost every episode Andy appeared in before Safety Training, his personality, his vibe for attention, dominates the episode. He has an impossible to miss presence in nearly every scene. Yet in Safety Training, Andy's return is entirely unceremonious. Instead of making a huge deal about Andy's presence, the writers immediately attempt to make Andy a regular and comfortable presence in the office. They write him as they write for Dwight or Jim, as a character who already belongs, instead of what it was before, a reoccurring cast member. Almost all of Andy's screen time in this episode is him dealing with minor situations that would have set him off before safety training. Dwight shuns him, Andy takes it in stride. Jim refuses to call him Drew, and Andy brushes it off. He even takes a moment at one point to partner up with Dwight in helping Michael set up the jump. That's as dramatic as his presence becomes in safety training. The episode isn't about Andy. He isn't a villain, he isn't an antagonist, he's just a member of the office. Safety training's restraint, its writing, that surely could have placed Andy front and center all over again, is how we know that Andy's presence is going to change moving forward. And it does. From safety training on, Andy does indeed evolve from a manic monstrosity to one of the most sympathetic and hilarious characters in The Office. Thanks a lot to Ed Helms, he develops nuance, his love for instruments, for people, and a desire for genuine friendship turns him around. But from a writing perspective, a lot of this has to do with him showing genuine compassion and care for and to Angela. And even more of it has to do with what I call shoe shifting. A big part of the reason Andy's change in character is so successful is a relatively common tactic in television. The writers make sure Andy goes from the bad guy to the victim. Suddenly, someone else is treating Andy even more poorly than he once treated everyone else, and Andy is helpless and naive to the mistreatment. It isn't a situation Andy himself creates. By making Andy vulnerable with Angela, by giving him genuine and recognizable emotion and having Angela stomp all over him while Andy desperately tries to cling to that partnership, suddenly, Andy becomes the good guy. The guy who we want to win. Not long before, we wanted Dwight back and Andy gone, and now Dwight is the vehicle by which Angela cheats on Andy, and therefore makes Andy the one to root for. Through a single failed relationship, the shoe shifts to the other foot. Through a single unrequited love, Andy becomes relatable, the most important adjective in television.
All you do is dress fancy and sing, oh la 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 la. What does that mean? You can't even protect her.
Through that relatability, Andy becomes a character we can genuinely understand. And that shift lasted long enough for Andy to do the absolute impossible and be the guy that the writers would one day replace Michael with for branch manager. A bout of character development that at one point in time seemed simply impossible. Yet, what I think is so interesting to me about the Andy Bernard situation is that it's, in the most endearing way, exactly what makes The Office so special. As ridiculous and absurd as it can get. For every moment where someone punches one of these holes in one of these walls, The Office was always built as and laid its foundation in being a show about real people. Real people are flawed, real people have problems, real people are complicated, but more poignantly, real people develop bonds. They do more than coexist. The Office, according to Michael Scott himself, is a family. These are people they see every day in this mockumentary, and camera are there to document that very thing. The Office works as a show because we believe they're the family Michael so desperately wants them to be. Dysfunctional, but that family. It works because we believe in these relationships, and under all the conflict is a group of people who, in sometimes strange ways, love each other. What we know about Michael and about family is that they will never, and he will never, give up on you, even when we, the outsiders looking in, do. In one episode, a group of writers found a way to turn around one of their most hopeless creations. Andy's change, Andy's growth makes sense, because if you've got a desk at the Scranton branch, the world's best boss will always be right there to... I recently rewatched this. This is what I would call a mistake. This is, in my opinion, the absolute worst episode of The Office. And it may not even be a close competition. But what's so unique about this particular episode is that it wasn't really supposed to be an episode of The Office at all. In fact, it was supposed to be an episode for an entirely different show, a backdoor pilot. An episode that was eventually shoved into The Office's 9th season and ran alongside that season when the show it was supposed to be the beginning of crumbled and failed. This isn't just the worst episode of The Office, it's one of the worst spin-off pilots ever created. And its 3 biggest problems are almost so obvious, it's almost hard to believe they even exist. This is The Farm.
Would the family care to say something?
You had black hair and then gray hair.
Once Steve Carell left the show, NBC quickly began to accept a simple and obvious reality. The Office, its #1 show, was on its last legs. And they weren't wrong. The show would slowly deteriorate in the absence of this guy. But NBC had what they believed to be a golden paper goose on their hands. So, they decided they were going to create a spin-off, but not a spin-off that carried with it the tone and ideas of the show itself. No, this spin-off would revolve around the least likable, but arguably most interesting character in the show, Dwight K. Schrute. So, they signed a pilot deal and went to work creating the episode of the show that they would pitch to executives. That pilot was built as the first episode of what you could call Schrute Farms. But The Office was still airing, so they built it as a backdoor pilot, something that, should the execs not like it, could be stuffed into The Office proper with a few tweaks. That's what that term means. The problem is, the execs didn't like it. In fact, no one really did. Once the episode aired, critics hated it. Viewers gave it a 1.6 out of 5 aggregate rating. It failed miserably, something even this man himself acknowledged. And it's not hard to see why. I think the first thing this strange piece of television gets wrong is the very thing that was supposed to make it interesting.
Nostalgia is truly one of the great human weaknesses, second only to the neck.
The episode keeps the underlying format of The Office, the talking head mockumentary style, but it makes a grave error. The Office works in its format because it feels like you're being brought into the lives of real people who are relatable. The writers have said that their goal was to fill The Office with characters that you know, your coworkers, neighbors, friends, parents. This episode, this spin-off, removes The Office's secret weapon, that relatability. As ridiculous as the show can get, it's grounded in personalities that you see in the real world. Building a show around Dwight and his incredibly idiosyncratic family means you're building a show that immediately exits the realm of reality. So absurdism becomes the only way to write the humor. There's something inherently funny about seeing people that are bad at their job that you can recognize in your life, all trying to coexist. There's nothing at all inherently funny about a socially inept beet farmer and his cartoon character-esque family. The Farm plays out like a show trying to convince you it can be funny. At some point, just not now. It gives you this guy and more of this guy and these people, and at surface value, these people seem like they're ripe for comedic situations. They just aren't really given any of those situations in this episode. And as it's presented to us as a backdoor pilot, the episode stuffs pieces of The Office proper and the people we know into the Farm as well. So we go from this to this, back to this, and to this, all in one episode. That means that this has to compete with and be as funny as this, which, as we all know, has already earned our interest. We already relate to it. I mentioned this recently, but a spinoff is going to carry the expectations of the original. And if it keeps a main character, the expectations are going to be that what you're getting keeps the best of what you know. The Farm removes that relatability, and leaves us with, well...
Totally. Yeah. The people here are like a fart. You know what I'm saying? Like a fart.
But it's also the way this episode kind of overdoes an already overdone portion of the main show that really makes it hard to watch. The talking heads, the confessional moments, when done right, are hilarious, sometimes revealing supplements to The Office. They help the show keep pace, and when used right, keep us the viewer engaged. But they also, towards the end of the show's run, when the writers were scrambling to retain intrigue, often became crutches that the show relied too heavily on. Crutches that too often halted the flow and rhythm of the episodes, that began to feel like the only way the writers were able to tell jokes, or even sometimes move the narrative or characters along. Well, The Farm does far worse. The Farm treats talking heads like they are the show, and treats everything else like the supplemental material. It reverses the function and the positives of the gimmick. And this was kind of a problem with attempting to create a spin-off in the same format as the main show to begin with. They now had to introduce all of these new characters in a single episode, whereas The Office was essentially recreating its first few episodes from source material. They practically already had their scripts, and people already knew what the show was. It was a known quantity. The Farm, however, wasn't. And it quickly turns into an almost comedy of exposition. It is ridiculous. It feels almost incapable of saying or doing anything outside of these moments. It's not even necessarily the abundance of them, it's that the writers seem incapable of making this new cast of characters interesting on their own merit. If you're going to build a show that relies on a family of characters like this, it's fair to assume that their interactions should drive the story. Instead, it's only the moments they're isolated where you get any actual intrigue. The Farm is a masterclass on misunderstanding why something worked to begin with. But I think the real problem with this episode has more to do with Dwight himself than anything else.
Little man, haven't seen you in a few years. What is this? Oh, God.
Some of the best moments of The Office are the moments where we see a side of characters that we don't get in the actual Office. It's why Dinner Party is widely regarded as the best episode in the show's run. The moments where you see Dwight actually training in karate, the moments where you see the farm's B&B, where you see Angela's cats in their natural habitat. But what makes Dwight the character so special is the mystery. You don't know if what he says is true 90% of the time. How he actually lives, he's an enigma. So the small peeks you get behind closed doors are unique and often hilarious moments. The Farm removes the single best thing about Dwight Schrute, the mystery, the intrigue. Dwight's life in the office is so interesting because for the most part, you kind of have to imagine the scenarios Dwight constantly tells us he ends up in. The jokes in the show land because he's serious, but you can't possibly imagine these things being real or what they'd look like. The same cannot really be said for any other character on the show. The Farm, however, kind of ruins that. It turns Dwight into a weirdo that we need to understand. And I don't think that was ever the point. For The Farm to have worked long term as a series, not only would we have had to understand Dwight, but we would have had to have access to every facet of his being in life. And it becomes much harder to put him in all of these fantastical situations Dwight's always claiming he's a part of. So Dwight in The Farm kind of just becomes the rock of his family unit. He becomes the normal one, which makes it much harder to write jokes for him, makes him far less interesting, it makes it harder to keep him interesting, and most importantly, it makes it much more difficult to keep us, the viewer, engaged in his story. You know what they say, a magician never reveals his tricks. Well, maybe we don't really need to know how the beats are made either. The Farm, to me, is a failure in nearly every way. Not only is it one of the worst, if not the worst episodes of The Office, but it's also one of the worst spin-off ideas and worst pilots I've ever seen. The idea of more Dwight sounded good on paper, but what The Farm proves is that Michael really was The Office. Sometimes things should end, and maybe the second he got on that plane is the moment we should have gone with him.
Psst. It's me, Aaron. Dwight had me pretend to be a hipster to create hype, and it's working. There's already people camped out behind me.
This is wrong, and that was obviously an opinion. The Office is maybe the most successful television show of all time. I've got an entire mini-series on this channel dedicated to just that show. But I think what's most interesting about The Office years after its run is how opinion is molded into something nearly ubiquitous around a few of the show's episodes. Scott's Tots being considered by many the worst episode of the series. But I wasn't sure I agree with that, so I did some digging, looked around the internet, and stumbled upon something more than just a tad subjective. Almost objective, if you can even call it that, and what I discovered is that Scott's Tots is not considered the worst episode of the series in terms of ratings. In fact, it doesn't even crack the top 15 lowest rated episodes. So I decided to take a look at what is considered 3 of the show's worst episodes and break down what doesn't work when The Office fails.
The record, not all Italian Americans are in the mafia.
I think he just seemed like he was trying to sell me insurance.
This episode is a season 6 episode titled Mafia. During the show's run, this episode was considered one of the show's worst. For a while, it was my least favorite episode as well. But unlike the next 2 episodes, it doesn't land here. This is IMDb, something if you're here, I'm sure you're familiar with. It's a rating system that allows viewers to vote on the best and worst of, well, anything, assigning a rating to each episode of the show. Objective in that it creates a ranking based on those votes, subjective in that they're still votes, or ratings. So what is wrong with this? Mafia is a very funny episode of The Office, but it's one of the only episodes in the first 6 seasons that runs the risk of flanderizing the show's characters. If you're here enough, you know what that means, but for those who aren't, flanderization is the act of taking a single trait of a character and exaggerating it to the point where it becomes the character, swallowing the personality whole. Mafia encroaches on this territory big time. Kevin's never been the brightest guy on earth, we know this, but in Mafia, he behaves so incredibly stupidly that he ends up stranding Jim and Pam on their honeymoon after speaking to a banker and having their cards cut off. This is in between him using Michael's office just to flatulate. Pure ineptitude. Meanwhile, Michael mistakes an insurance salesman for a member of the mafia? Well, that's funny. Well, it would have been funny. Instead, Dwight and Andy convince Michael that he is a member of the mafia and string Michael along for an entire episode. Problem is, none of them seem to be aware this insurance salesman is just that. Absurd ineptitude. The point here is actually stated by Oscar.
Pam and Jim are on their honeymoon, so there's not the usual balance between sane and others.
By removing Jim and Pam from this episode, you have the chance to give your supporting characters time to shine. Instead, this episode shows every character at their dumbest, most manipulative, and most conspiratorial. The branch doesn't branch out, it flanderizes. This flanderization actually becomes the show's biggest downfall, both early and at the end of the show's run, forcing the show to rewrite Michael after season 1 and reintroduce Andy as essentially an entirely new character after his original guest run had ended. And to complete that, obviously this flanderization was the exact thing that took down the show in the last 2 seasons, specifically with Andy Bernard once again. But to this day, I find Mafia hilarious, even though it does foreshadow the show's eventual issues. So I kept looking.
Val's no help, Andy's gone, Jim's out. I just feel like I'm on my own here.
Remember how I said that Mafia didn't give its supporting characters the chance to shine in personality ways that you'd expect? Well, this is the 15th worst rated episode in the show's entire run. It's the season 9 episode, Vandalism. This is an episode that the industry calls a lower deck episode. A lower deck episode of a show is one that focuses primarily on supplementary or side characters almost exclusively, usually with storylines that don't move the overall narrative forward. At this point in the show's run, the very structure of the episode became one of the show's biggest issues. See, in this lower deck episode, every character behaves, well, in ways that feel a bit inauthentic. And it may not be surprising to note that the lead writer, well, this was only his 3rd credit of that kind, and it was the first episode directed by this man. Pam here is really the primary focus. Someone vandalizes the mural and she goes on the hunt. This ends with a very not Pamish confrontation at the end of the episode that is not as funny as much as it is strange. Derailed becomes a secondary focus. He's sick of dealing with Jim being a slob. But is that how you would describe Jim? I'm betting the answer is no, but it does create conflict. And Angela is throwing a birthday party with the senator, bickering with Oscar along the way and then being saved by Kevin. This episode isn't just usually unfunny, it often verges on surreal, like a series of deleted scenes or ideas spliced together to create a story. Almost like the budget had run dry and they had to work with what they had. The problem here is that when Michael left the office, the show made a grave error. Instead of trying to replace his presence, they began rotating new presences. It's not just that Michael was a great character, it's that he was the main character and his presence grounded the show's narrative and structure. When he left and that presence wasn't filled, the show became incredibly unfocused. As a result, every episode was forced to become a lower deck episode, a style usually relegated to filler episodes of larger seasons of serialized shows. So in turn, what Vandalism represents is the filler that should have been optional, not necessary. Not to mention, this episode carries the Looney Tunes approach that the show veered into here.
Here I am, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours!
Get the girl. This season 8 episode is the lowest rated Office episode in the show's run. This episode represents almost everything wrong with The Office when it's not at its peak. This episode is what some call a road episode. It's an episode of a series that travels outside of its normal setting, a fancy TV phrase really meaning TV road trip. What really went wrong for The Office towards the end, and even in its failed spin-off episodes, like The Farm, is tonality. More concisely, inconsistency in tonality. As The Office lost focus, so too did its tone. While the show always flirted with the absurd, a lot of the last 2 seasons are pure slapstick. The Office meets Looney Tunes. In Get the Girl, we see a reoccurrence of things The Office had already done better, quite literally. A poor performance review, seen it. A newcomer taking someone's desk, seen it, and potentially job, seen that as well. And a love trip, also seen that. Except here, this B storyline does all of that worse and more absurdly than the show has in the past. Well, except for that road trip. Because more importantly, that B storyline clashes in tone dramatically with its A or main storyline, Andy going to secure his love with Aaron. These are 2 different episodes of 2 different seasons of a show crammed together, and neither work. Andy Bedard's flanderization, Full Circle, reaches its peak here as his plotline sees him singing, heavy-handedly loving and reaching in some of the most awkward scenes in the show's history. A culmination, by the way, of a storyline, Aaron and Andy, that didn't work well for nearly 2 full seasons, and yet here it's doubled down on. Again, in the most heavy-handed way possible. No subtlety, and believe me, little humor. This is all interspliced with the pure and utter lunacy of that B storyline. This episode plays like someone punching you in the face and feeding you cake in between each hit. If you're going to try to create emotional weight, you can't lift that weight every 3 minutes and hope it's still there when the audience comes back. Just like in life, emotion is fleeting, and if you get too distracted, well, the moment's gone, and so is the emotion.
Hey, guys, listen up. Michael is up on the roof and acting strange.
As all of you know, I love The Office, and I actually don't hate the final 2 seasons, but it is interesting that the 15 worst rated Office episodes only include 1 coming from another season other than those final 2. To me, The Office is a lesson in what it means to lose sight of your idea. That fleetingness again. When you do for an episode or a moment, like Mafia, it's okay as long as you regain that train of thought. Lower Deck episodes, road episodes, even bottle episodes make up the final seasons of a ton of sitcoms. Look at Family Guy, every other episode is a special now. South Park playing with serialization suddenly, and the list goes on and on. When you begin to use new ideas as a crutch, as opposed to a supplement, that's the moment your show has ended, whether you keep making episodes or not. Whether those new ideas are characters, love lines, or specials. So the next time you're writing something, or better yet, watching something, ask yourself this: can what's happening on the screen be described the same way as you would describe the show to your friends if you were recommending it to them? And if the answer is no, how long ago was it when that show or movie series was the thing you used to describe it as? If you can't answer that second question, it might be time to turn off the TV, because someone somewhere has lost sight of their Michael Scott.
This is gonna feel so good getting this thing off my chest.
You look like you want to tell me something. You look like you have something really important to say and you just can't for some reason. Jim, you can tell me anything.
When you think about The Office, one of the first things that pops into your head is the relationship between Pam and Jim. For the better part of a decade, they were seen as America's couple. But here's the thing, this relationship was almost destroyed entirely late into the show's final season, with the introduction of Brian Whittle. Brian Whittle was the primetime television equivalent to a giant asteroid narrowly missing the planet. It's one thing to throw a wrench into a show's primary dramatic storyline, but breaking a show's firmly established narrative structure with only 15 episodes remaining in its entire run is a cardinal sin. And with the abrupt introduction of Brian into the story, much like Pam, The Office was flirting with disaster.
I just feel like I'm on my own here. I mean, okay, not completely on my own, but in terms of people who can do something, thank you, Brian.
The Office's comedy is certainly driven by its ensemble cast of top-tier comedic talent. Throughout the entire show's run, almost every single reoccurring character has an opportunity to really shine. The mixing and matching of these incredible characters is done in a way that always feels fun, fresh, and exciting. We really get to see a lot of these characters pair off in ways that played with the overall charisma of the show. Michael and Dwight played with the hero-sidekick dynamic filtered through a veneer of ineptitude, whereas Jim and Dwight often felt like a real-life version of Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Throughout the show's run, we see a lot of this character shuffling. The writers seem to have a lot of fun pairing characters together to see what worked and what didn't. And more often than not, it ended up being pretty successful. Despite the writers' penchant for mixing and matching characters, Jim and Pam's relationship never really strayed from our interest. Even when Jim transferred to Stamford to distance himself from Pam, their relationship was still a focal point of the show. It was a fresh take on an aging and tired will they or won't they trope that really piqued viewers' interest.
So,
do you... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, everything's pretty much the same here.
Oh, good.
Their relationship is really what makes The Office work so well, because it hits us right in the heart. We see these two characters and we want them to be together, and after they are together, we want them to stay together. They are, without a doubt, the most important characters on the show in the sense that They serve as a grounding tool for some of the more insane characters on the show. Their reactions to any given situation presented on the show are incredibly normal, and through this normalcy, these reactions allow the absurd behaviors of the supporting cast to really stand out. Without Jim and Pam there for us to relate to, The Office would likely derail itself into an absurd clown show. This was even more true for the show after Steve Carell's departure. This all almost came to a crashing halt in the middle of the show's final season at the end of the episode titled Customer Loyalty. After an intense fight over the phone over Pam's failure to film their child's dance recital, Pam begins to emotionally break down. This has happened before on the show, but this time, something rather strange happens. The camera pans away from the action at hand and toward the actual crew, who have been serving as silent observers to Dunder Mifflin's daily operations for a decade. We aren't quite sure what to call this. In a show that constantly breaks the fourth wall, this is like breaking the fifth wall. We are then introduced to the character of Brian, the boom operator, for the first time as he rushes to console Pam during a time of crisis. In this seemingly white knight moment, he tells the camera crew to stop filming and give Pam some space.
I just didn't know that it was going to be this hard.
Let's turn the cameras off. Seriously, guys. Enough.
It feels like a strangely intimate moment, and it's made even stranger by the first scene of the following episode, Junior Salesman. At the top of this episode, Pam has a brief conversation with Brian, who has apparently been reprimanded for intervening in the previous day's dramatics between Pam and Jim.
Well, thanks for being a good friend.
Sure. Anytime. How about you and Jim? Everything squared away?
Yeah. Mostly.
In Andy Green's book, The Office, The Untold Story of the Greatest Sitcom of the 2000s, it is mentioned that Greg Daniels was actually intending on having Pam and Brian seem like that they were going to hook up in an attempt to shake up Jim and Pam's relationship, ultimately leading to a separation. Writer Brent Forrester said that the intent was to have Jim and Pam split up and have them rekindle their relationship in the final episode. Jim and Pam separating and reconciling wouldn't be a weird thing or even necessarily a bad thing. They had done it before, and it's not like marriages don't come without their struggles. The problem here is that the writers are trying to shake up too many things at once. By breaking the fourth wall and actually showing the crew, The Office breaks its narrative and it changes the entire tone, feeling, and style of the show. Having one of these crew members insert themselves into the show's primary narrative feels disrespectful to the viewers. John Krasinski actually had the wherewithal to say something to Brent Forrester about the move to split up Jim and Pam in this way. According to Forrester, Krasinski said that since this final season of The Office was essentially for the mega fans of the show, it would be too painful for them to see Jim and Pam go through a divorce. The episode that really made fans upset is in the episode titled Vandalism, where Brian steps in to physically defend Pam from an attack.
So someone needs to shut you up! Hey! Whoa! Easy!
This was the moment where Greg Daniels was finally able to see that he was heading down a dangerous path with these two characters. There were only a handful of episodes left to produce, and fans were becoming increasingly agitated with the idea of this character being forced down their throats as a potential paramour, and destroying something they had watched grow and evolve for a decade. This prompted some quick thinking on behalf of the writers and editors, and Brian's character was whittled down to little more than a speed bump on Jim and Pam's journey. We see Brian one more time when Pam heads over to his home to ask him just how much privacy the documentarians violated during their time filming Dunder Mifflin. And honestly, watching this scene play out is kind of nerve-wracking at first. We don't really want to see Pam hook up with Brian. We don't even want to think about it. At this point, audience members are likely audibly shouting the words, "Don't do it, Pam," at their televisions. Thankfully, Pam just asks him a simple question, leaves, and Brian is never heard from again. Having Jim and Pam go through a separation would have been really tough on viewers who knew that their time with them was coming to a close. Having Jim and Pam go through a separation because of Pam's infidelity would have been disastrous. Having that infidelity occur with a character whose very appearance disrupts the show's narrative would have destroyed the show entirely. It would have been thoughtless and maybe a little callous towards what drew viewers to The Office in the first place. Sometimes writers feel the need to make drastic changes to keep the audiences interested, and in some cases that might be true, but The Office was so successful that it stopped becoming just a television show for some people, and in turn became more of a comfort. It was somewhere we could go to have a few laughs and a few feels for a brief amount of time, and you can't disrupt something like that so abruptly, especially after telling the audience that this is the last season that they would be receiving that comfort. Thankfully, Greg Daniels realized this and was able to fix the problem before it was too late. But to this day, the character of Brian Whittle is one of the most hated characters in sitcom history, and the scar that he left on audiences' hearts will always kind of be there. The Office actually wraps up quite perfectly. There's no shredding of divorce papers, no forced drama, it's just fun, heartwarming, and silly.
That's the way it is around here. It just kind of goes around and around.
You should have put him in custody.
Oh, hey, yes, new guy.
This is how we were introduced to Ryan Howard, and this is how Ryan ended up.
I let him suck on a strawberry. He's allergic, but he'll get over it fast. I had to talk to you.
You gave your baby an allergic reaction just to talk to me?
The Office's Ryan Howard has perhaps one of the most tragic character arcs in the history of sitcoms. He was a man who began his career at the quaint Dunder Mifflin Paper Company as an overqualified temp, ultimately ending the series as a funhouse mirror reflection of his former self. The aimlessness of Ryan is indicative of the uncertainty of what to do with the character, morphing Ryan from an audience POV everyman to a bizarre series of changes that encapsulate all the ways the series went off the rails in its final years.
You got this kosher certified?
No, I meant like, it's cool, it's kosher, it's all good.
The issues with Ryan Howard as a character begins with the character's very existence in the first place. The NBC sitcom The Office is a remake of the BBC sitcom of the same name. In the show's initial season, the US and UK versions of The Office align very closely, right down to the pilot episode of the US version being ostensibly an Americanized remake of the UK show's first episode. Both shows have a primary cast of 4 key archetypal characters: the boss, Michael Scott, in the US version, and David Brent in the UK, the Office sycophant, Dwight in the US and Gareth in the UK, and finally the will they won't they romantic pairing, Jim and Pam in the US and Tim and Dawn in the UK. This core quartet theory provided the UK Office with all the characters it needed to carry the primary plot of 2 seasons of television and a Christmas special, with the occasional pop-in from scene-stealing side characters.
Bring your boyfriend down tonight if you want.
I don't have a boyfriend.
Whatever. Oh, sorry. That is a man's game.
After seeing this successful formula for the UK series, it's suddenly disorienting to throw on the US version of The Office and find a 5th character thrown into the central cast, BJ Novak as Ryan Howard. Now, this is no slight to BJ Novak, who is a fine performer and comedian, but seeing his name among the other 4 leads in the show's opening credits suggests he'll be a crucial part to the story. In the world of The Office, Ryan exists in this weird middle ground between the primary 4 characters and the background office workers. He has a lot of screen time, but that attention is due to his relationship with funnier, more compelling characters. This can be seen in the one-sided friendship with Michael, where the comedy comes from Michael's embarrassingly desperate bids to win Ryan's admiration, which are met with comedic non-reactions.
Right here. 3 shooters. High five.
Additionally, there's his toxic relationship with Kelly, where the comedy comes from her obsession with him, and once again, he is overshadowed by the sheer comedic force of Kelly's unhealthy obsessions.
Now I have a boyfriend.
All right. I hooked up with her on February 13th.
He is simply reactive to the antics around him. He has no real defined personality or even a comedic gimmick like many of the supporting characters of the show. All evidence suggests Ryan should be a vital character, but he doesn't have any major growth as a character until season 4.
Who was that?
Nobody. You and I are done.
What?
The punchline of Ryan being the one to take the coveted corporate job in the season 3 finale works so well because Ryan has flown so far under the radar over the course of the show. Not only does it finally give the character a goal and objective, it launches him into the heart of darkness of corporate life that will warp the character forever. There are essentially 3 major acts in the desolation of Ryan Howard. The first being the corporate sellout phase. With his newfound status as the self-described wonderkin of Dunder Mifflin, Ryan begins to throw his weight around at his former stomping grounds. He dresses flashy, or at least a version of what he imagines is flashy, and tries to modernize Dunder Mifflin in multiple ways, with his flagship idea being a new website, Dunder Mifflin Infinity. Ryan basically morphs into a Bret Easton Ellis character that's dropped into a sitcom.
And if they knew how much I was paying for my haircut now, they wouldn't be giving me a noogie. was $200.
Now, it's important to note that this sudden change, while comedic, is built on a shaky ground of being a cardboard cutout of a character for 3 whole seasons. While there are certainly suggestions of Ryan's ambition to climb the corporate ladder with references to his business school background, this extreme of a change feels out of nowhere. And while it's a humorous bit of satire to watch this bland, regular middle management guy suddenly become a Jordan Belfort-esque avatar of greed because of a corporate job at a paper company of all places, the jokes aren't exactly breaking any new ground about white-collar jobs that we haven't already heard a million times before.
Problems like that will not happen when we launch Dunder Mifflin Infinity 2.0.
When will that be?
TBD.
Ryan's erratic behavior and the failure of Dunder Mifflin Infinity leads to his massive fall from grace, going as far as to defraud the company before getting arrested. This leads into what we can call the Chaos Goblin Ryan era.
I'm keeping a list of everyone who wrongs me, so when I'm back on top, they'll be sorry. Kevin just made the list.
Here we have another major personality shift in Ryan, one where his inhibitions have been completely removed and he functions almost entirely as a creature of pure id. For most of season 5, he is rude and obnoxious to everyone around him. Michael takes pity on Ryan and allows him to return to Dunder Mifflin, making him determined to climb the ladder again, until he breaks up with Kelly and supposedly runs away to Thailand. This constant back and forth of growth and setback is another example of how the writers seem to have no concrete ideas for the character.
I never went to Thailand.
Really?
I went to Fort Lauderdale.
Was it nice?
Yeah, it was amazing.
Ryan returns again and becomes one of the chosen few employees to join the Michael Scott Paper Company because Michael is the only one still willing to give him a chance after all he has done. Although the character now finally has the personality he was lacking all this time, this comedic persona is indicative of a larger problem facing The Office as a series in these later seasons. The show has drifted away from the dry, deadpan humor that gave the mockumentary aspect of The Office a sense of verisimilitude. 5 years in, the show's sense of humor has become so broad that Ryan's transformation feels cartoonish rather than a representation of how a human being would behave.
They shake the baby and you gotta, you can't do that.
Don't shake our baby.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd never heard that before.
This brings us to the final form of Ryan Howard in season 6 through 9, hipster, doofus, creep. Now that Ryan has returned to the world of office worker after the merger of Dunder Mifflin and the Michael Scott Paper Company, he has become somewhat more professional again. But now he dresses as a stereotypical hipster. And while he is still trying to scheme his way back to the top of the corporate ladder, he seems to have completely lost most of his business acumen and just seems like a fool. The Office is a series that thrives on uncomfortable, awkward moments of humor, but the audience always felt like they were part of the joke. Ryan, however, is truly irredeemable at this point.
Well, I think he can be corrupted, like Gollum.
Smeagol was corrupted and became Gollum.
And in the finale, as every other character reaches their own satisfying ending, he ultimately backslides once again and hooks up with Kelly. His presence when the show ends in the final seasons is a final condemnation of how The Office has lost its way in the final seasons with humor that relies way too much on outlandish situations rather than truth and character. These many seasons of aimless wandering for the character are an illustration of the strange ways long-form television can grow and evolve. In comedy shows especially, it can take many episodes for the writers to find the voice or the comedic game of a character. With Ryan, his journey can be read one of two ways. The writers weren't really clear on what direction to ever take the character, or Ryan is a metaphor for the way the corporate world can break a person's spirit, which can certainly be darkly funny in its own way, but it feels strange when contrasted with the humorous day-to-day activities of the Office's found family. By trying to shoehorn in these supposedly comedic, outlandish scenarios for Ryan to be in, the show lost sight of its greatest comedic weapon, the strength of its characters. Without it, we see a character arc that holistically feels more like tragedy than comedy.
You're English, correct?
Yeah, big time, yeah.
I'm working on an English character. Would you mind? It's called Reginald Poofda.
Oh, David Brent, my liege.
Both versions of The Office are practically comedy institutions at this point. However, these are just 2 of 14 total remakes of the now iconic show. The Office's brand of anxiety-inducing and cringe-laden theatrics has officially taken the world by storm.
Knock, knock. Who's there? KGB.
KGB.
Viva
ask the questions.
What the hell was that?
But how has this show succeeded in remaking itself, crossing cultural boundaries, and amassing fan bases in nearly every culture on Earth? The answer is simple. Middle-class daily grievances are universal.
What is your name, sir? I am Bill Buttlicker. Really, that's your real name? How dare you?
Created by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant, The Office began airing on BBC Two in July of 2001. It was a near-instant success. The high concept of an overbearing, cringeworthy boss and the poor workaday employees that had to tolerate his antics was a perfectly communicable premise.
The question is, do you feel lucky, punk? Well, do ya? Clint Eastwood. Spot on.
The series was renewed for a second season and a subsequent Christmas special, before Gervais and Merchant decided to move on to other projects. However, this is where something truly strange happened. The Office's DVD sales were so gargantuan that Hollywood came knocking, wanting to produce an American remake.
A good idea is a good idea forever.
Developed by Greg Daniels, the co-creator of King of the Hill, the American version of The Office used many of the same character archetypes from the British show, but ported them to the idyllically suburban Scranton, Pennsylvania. While the American show lasted significantly longer than the British version, many of the overarching plot details, character relationships, and comedic setups closely resemble the original show. The most obvious being the Jim and Pam will they won't they storyline, which is almost one-to-one with the Tim and Dawn storyline from the original show. Of course, Dwight is essentially Gareth, and the iconic character of Michael Scott is basically the Americanized David Brent. And here's where things take a turn, unlike nearly anything in sitcom history previously. With the meteoric success of both the British and American offices underway, a sharp uptick in interest happened. Different cultures from across the globe all seem to want their own versions of The Office. The first remake outside of the two well-known ones was a 2004 German show called Stromberg. This even harder-edged version of the David Brent archetype, named Bernd Stromberg, would be the harbinger of the soon-to-be-developed universe of Office remakes. In 2006, two more countries, Canada and France, each got official remakes, with La Job and Le Bureau. For the Canadian show, the regional manager was even named after the franchise co-creator, being given the name David Gervais. Despite the Canadian show only lasting one season, the French show ran for 6 years. The genie had been let out of the bottle. The appetite for more Office remakes across the globe had been ignited. Over the next 15 years, 9 more Office remakes would be produced. Saudi Arabia, India, Finland, and the Czech Republic being just a few of the examples. The Office is one of the rare examples of a truly global brand, a show that has a laser focus and is both hyper-specific and universal at the same time. Everyone has had to deal with the frustrating boss or annoying coworkers. Everyone has had an office crush or a break room best friend. The reason The Office translates so well to other cultures is that every burgeoning middle class across the globe has ostensibly the same problems. Therefore, the show can be viewed more as a formula where the only significant variable is the cultural trappings of the country in question. While Stromberg is fairly different from any of the other Offices, due in large part to the fact that it wasn't exactly legally produced, many of the remake series feature episodes that are almost shot-for-shot remakes of the BBC version. In fact, some of the international Office remakes have lines in their licensing agreements that state that the shows must recreate the first 3 episodes of the British show, and then will be allowed to develop off in their own directions. When you step back and examine things from a distance, it doesn't seem like any of this should work. It seems like there should be a loss of the magic that made the original Office culturally transcendent, but it just simply doesn't work that way. The various remakes might not all land in their cultures the way the British or American ones have, but for the most part, they've all been pretty successful. A few of the series ran for 1 or 2 seasons, sure, but even then, they're still funny. And some, like the French, German, and Indian Offices, are very popular. The practice of remaking international films and TV shows happens all the time. The Mexican Breaking Bad, the Russian It's Always Sunny, and the American Old Boy. They are all perfect examples of remakes that have failed to capture the spark of the original piece of material. They all tried to localize the source material, but lost what made the original story so great in the process. That seems to be the key to The Office, however. It's such a simple setup and has so many clearly defined and clearly delineated characters that it actually is possible to localize and replicate. The characters and overarching themes more or less stay the same, and the specific details are what are moved around and localized. From the original receptionist Dawn Tinsley, played by Lucy Davis, you can draw a straight line to Pam Beesly in the American Office, or Ann Veens in La Job, or Dana in Hamisrad, the Israeli Office. The same can be said for Gareth or Dwight or Ernie from Stromberg or Viking Yetterman from the Swedish office Contoret. The characters all have the same core tenets and characteristics, but the specific details and hang-ups manifest in highly specific localized details. Like how the Indian office's Jagdeep Chadha organizes a Diversity Day team building exercise that goes horribly wrong, which is obviously very close to the Diversity Day that Michael Scott organizes.
Shalom. I'd like to apply for a loan.
The jokes and cultural biases that are explored in these two scenes are wildly different, but the underlying idea is the same. It all boils down to the boss is culturally insensitive.
How are you?
I just had the longest meeting.
Oh, welcome to my convenience store.
Even though the success rate for the franchises vary from culture to culture, the overall brand of Office remakes shows no sign of slowing down. There's a simple mathematical formula for the broader success of The Office that Gervais, Merchant, and BBC Two have discovered. A winning formula that many production companies would give their right arm to have. You take the basic setups from the original Office, and you port them over to a culture with a rapidly burgeoning middle class, and then hire local talent to tailor the archetypes to the specific region or culture. Then, you just sit back and print money.
What's the ratio of Stanley Nichols to Shrewd Bucks?
The same as the ratio of unicorns to leprechauns.
It's a business model almost unlike anything else ever seen in the history of the entertainment landscape. Usually when something is wildly successful, sequels that have ever-increasing scale and scope are rushed into production. But with The Office, it's not the scale or the size of the stories that matters. It's the specificity. It is the details that stand in for the universal frustrations of everyday mundanity that connects with audiences all over the world. And, in fact, the small scale of the stories actually helps the show. It's cheap to produce, cheap to edit, and doesn't require any special effects. The overhead is low, and the potential upside is huge. Everyone has struggled to rectify their place in life with their hopes and dreams for the future, and The Office provides a clearly defined hierarchy of power. And we as a global species can live out a fantasy of getting to make snarky eye contact with the cameraman when something terrible is happening. In real life, we don't have anyone to acknowledge the frictions and frustrations of middle-class ennui. But The Office, in all its forms, holds up a mirror to our collective subconscious and says, you're not alone, while also submerging a stapler in Jell-O.
What are you doing? Oh, come on. You're ruining it. Toby, come on. Just look at that. That's wrecked. Ass.
That was the first time Michael Scott ever told Toby Flenderson that he was ruining something. But it wouldn't be the last. The characters seemed almost scientifically designed to get on each other's nerves, and their unending feud provided the basis for some of The Office's funniest moments, which is why it may be surprising to learn that this moment from a scene deleted in the show's 4th episode wasn't a part of the creator's original vision. In fact, Michael hating Toby wasn't the creator's idea at all.
I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
On March 24th, 2005, the world got its first look at the American version of the hit British sitcom, The Office. The single-cam workplace comedy had a mockumentary format which followed the day-to-day lives of the employees in the Scranton, Pennsylvania branch of the fictional Dunder Mifflin Paper Company. The star of the show was its incredible ensemble cast, and at the center of that, at least for the most successful part of its run, was regional manager Michael Scott, played by Steve Carell. Michael is, in many ways, the worst kind of boss.
I think that pretty much sums it up. I found it at Spencer Gifts.
He's a desperately lonely man who treats his office as his home and his employees as his friends and family. That's not a great situation in any case, but it's especially bad for Dunder Mifflin because Michael lacks any real social skills. He's highly prone to embarrassing both himself and his staff in his deeply misguided attempts to curry their respect.
I'm Hitler!
To that end, Michael is perpetually neglecting the actual business of the office in favor of doing things that are fun and exciting, or at least what he thinks is fun and exciting.
Every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way.
But we tolerate and even sympathize with Michael because the writing, as well as Carell's nuanced performance, never lets us forget that, at heart, he's just a sweet, albeit deeply inept man who just wants to have people in his life that love and appreciate him. Of course, that doesn't change that he's a nightmare to work for, and that is where Toby Flenderson enters the picture.
I need to talk to you in your office. It'll just take 2 seconds.
Literally 2 seconds?
An original character invented for the American version of The Office, Toby was played by series writer, director, producer, and future showrunner Paul Lieberstein. After inviting Lieberstein to be a writer on season 1, series creator Greg Daniels invented the character for Lieberstein to play on account of Daniels' belief that acting made writers better. It's the same belief that led him to cast writers BJ Novak as Ryan Howard, Mindy Kaling as Kelly Kapoor, and co-executive producer Michael Schur as Mose.
It's kind of a troupe of people who understand writing and performing all at the same time.
As a Dunder Mifflin human resources rep, it's Toby's job to enforce the corporate procedures that protect the company's employees from, well, pretty much every allegedly fun or exciting thing Michael ever says or does.
My job is to make the office fun. Your job is to make the office lame.
And Toby does his job about as gently as anyone could possibly ask from a man in his position. But from Michael's perspective, it makes Toby a perpetual wet blanket who's constantly preventing Michael from winning the love of his prospective workplace family.
I mean, you still can't make fun of people for race or gender or sexual orientation or religion.
Who let the lemon head into the room? You are a waste of life, and you should give up.
Exacerbating Michael's contempt for Toby is that the two have conspicuously opposite personalities. Michael is loud, often brimming with manic energy and determined to be the center of attention, whereas Toby is a soft-spoken sad sack.
Toby, doesn't HR have some rules against talking about this kind of stuff?
Aaron, HR is a joke. I can't do anything about anything.
Everything about Toby clashes with everything about Michael, and the two can't help but to irritate each other, which is ironic because, at some level, both men just want to be liked by others. In fact, as different as they may seem on the surface, it's actually their deep underlying similarities as middle-aged men who have grown lonely and unhappy working dead-end jobs that scares Michael so thoroughly.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
Michael wants to see himself as a happy, well-liked, well-adjusted guy like Jim, but the sight of Toby just reminds him of who he really is.
This is the worst. This is the worst. You are the worst. I hate looking at your face. I want to smash it.
The mutually antagonistic relationship is so brilliantly developed, it's difficult to believe that the writers didn't design the Toby character with that specific dynamic in mind. But the truth is, they didn't. Toby appears in 2 of the first 3 episodes of the series, and while he and Michael do have their infamous confrontation over sitting Indian style,
Hey, we're not all gonna sit in a circle Indian style, are we?
Get out. It was offensive and lame. So double offensive.
there's no evidence that there's any special animosity between the characters. That's because, though many fans don't realize it, the idea wasn't first conceived until the filming of what would eventually become a deleted scene from the 4th episode of season 1, The Alliance. According to Lieberstein,
We never had this meeting where we were like, okay, what if Michael hates Toby? You know, that was never, it just happened.
in the scene, Toby walks into Michael's office to sign a birthday card for Meredith. Michael happily obliges and then watches over Toby's shoulder as he proceeds to sign the card. After a few seconds, a suddenly pissy Michael, who has spent the day trying to come up with a perfect joke for the card, stops Toby. He objects to the joke he is writing about Meredith's red hair on the grounds that he intended to mention her hair in his own message. Then he orders Toby to cross the joke off the card. Even though Michael isn't actually his superior and can't fire him, Toby obeys. But that only seems to make Michael angrier. He complains that Toby has now ruined the card, and then the scene ends with Michael throwing Toby out of his office to go find some whiteout, even though there's already some on his desk.
That's wrecked. Ass. Get some whiteout.
There's some right there.
That's my whiteout. Get your own whiteout.
It looks and feels like a classic Michael-Toby moment, but in reality, Michael's reaction was totally ad-libbed by Ferrell. Lieberstein would later recall, I just go in, write something quickly and leave, that's the scene. But it takes me a while to physically write it, and I could just feel Steve Carell watching me and feel that burning. Steve told me afterwards that it was that moment that he just decided to hate me so much. Office stars Jenna Fisher, who played Pam, and Angela Kinsey, who played Angela, discussed Lieberstein's recollections on their podcast, Office Ladies, with Fisher adding,
That was when they ran with it, that Paul went to the writers and said, Michael hates Toby. Because if Jim took a long time to write a message, he would have all the patience in the world.
The fact that Toby would be an object of contempt and a source of resentment for Michael seems obvious in retrospect. But even with a room full of the best comedy writers in the world, it took the comedic instincts of a master improviser like Steve Carell to recognize that Toby ruining things for Michael was more than just a one-off gag. It was their whole relationship.
Toby's divorced. He, recently, right? You and your wife?
And you have kids?
According to Lieberstein, it's terrifying acting with Steve. He misses nothing. Carell's powerful instincts about how his character should relate to Toby led him to make a choice in the moment, and that choice changed the dynamic of the two characters in a way that would continue to pay dividends throughout the entire series.
If I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden, and Toby, I would shoot Toby twice.
The takeaway is that while it's tempting for many to credit writers with everything we see on screen, it's important to remember that, at its heart, television is really an incredibly collaborative medium. The characters we love and the stories that keep us tuning in again and again for years at a time aren't just the product of a single visionary creator, or even a brilliant writer's room. They're composites of the creative talents of everyone involved in bringing the show to the screen. Creators, writers, directors, and certainly not least, the actors.
You don't hear a lie. I think you're great. You're my best friend.
1, 2, 3.
To new friends. This is gonna take hours.
That is Will Ferrell, one of the funniest comic actors who ever lived, showing up to play a guest role on The Office, one of the funniest and most revered sitcoms of its era. It sounds like a recipe for laughs, but as it turns out, not so much. In fact, against all odds, The Office found a way to do something that's usually pretty close to impossible. They made Will Ferrell not funny.
Coffee keeps me regular.
Yeah.
That's the best time of the day in that regard.
Right.
It's the best time of the day.
Right.
The American version of The Office debuted in 2005. It had an outstanding ensemble cast, but the star was clearly Steve Carell, already famous for his appearances in movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin and his regular spot as a correspondent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Playing Michael Scott, the big-hearted but wildly unprofessional and borderline incompetent regional manager of the Scranton, Pennsylvania branch of the Dunder Mifflin Paper Company, Carell was the linchpin and heart of the series. Fans and critics loved him in the role, and he received 5 Emmy nominations and 1 win at the Golden Globes for his performance. Like the rest of the cast, Carell's contract expired at the end of season 7. But unlike the rest, Carell's contract would not wind up being renewed. Continuing a series after losing a lead is never a sure thing. The Office, however, remained successful in the ratings, and thanks to the fact that its cast was still stacked with stars like John Krasinski, Mindy Kaling, and Ed Helms, it wasn't as reliant on Carell's drawing power as it once was. For creative reasons, the decision was made to give Michael an emotional send-off 4 episodes before the end of season 7, and then to continue the series without him. Carell's departure was announced in January of 2011, and shortly thereafter, it was reported that The Office had booked comedy legend Will Ferrell for a 4-episode run that would mostly overlap with Carell's final appearances. The coverage also revealed that Ferrell would play a Michael Scott-like middle management type, leading to speculation that the producers might be setting up Ferrell to take over for Carell as the boss in the following season.
Big changes are coming, and they're coming fast.
Interestingly, the appearance was Ferrell's idea. According to the actor, he approached the producers about doing a single guest spot, but they came back to him with a whole character arc.
This all sounds great to me.
A veteran of TV from his days on Saturday Night Live, Ferrell had made sporadic guest appearances on the small screen even as his film career took off. His role as Ashley Schaefer on Eastbound and Down proved he could do a lot with a small part, and the movie Anchorman proved he had great comic chemistry with Carell.
Yeah, I stabbed a man in the heart. I saw that. Brick killed a guy.
So, Office fans were rightfully excited. As promised, Ferrell playing a character named D'Angelo Vickers arrived in the 19th installment of Season 7, Training Day. The episode starts when Michael and D'Angelo meet at a bar. At first, they think it's random, but after a while, they finally figure out they were, in fact, there to meet each other.
That is insane! That is insane.
It quickly becomes apparent that D'Angelo shares some of Michael's goofier idiosyncrasies, and they hit it off immediately. Despite the similarities, though, D'Angelo seems to be a little more confident and generally more normal than Michael, and when he meets the employees of Dunder Mifflin, they genuinely seem to like him.
Someone started off on a good foot with the new boss.
His jokes land, his tastes are appreciated, and he's immediately embraced with the kind of warmness that Michael has always desired from his staff. Predictably, Michael starts to resent the situation, and it creates tension between him and D'Angelo, putting the staff awkwardly in the middle of a struggle between their current and future bosses. Over the course of the story, it emerges that D'Angelo has a bit of a mean streak. For example, when he seems to get off on making Andy humiliate himself, or when he rudely shuts down Pam when she's gushing about a cute thing her baby did.
I'm telling you, that baby could be the star of a show called Babies I Don't Care About.
But regardless of how badly he treats them, everyone is well aware that D'Angelo is about to be the boss, so when push comes to shove, the employees all side with him over Michael, despite a personal appeal from the latter. It's a bitter reminder to Michael that his relationship to his work family would be different when he's not the boss. While he doesn't get anything all that funny to do, D'Angelo actually makes a fairly complex and intriguing foil for Michael in that episode. And though the understated role doesn't necessarily play to his strengths as a comic performer, Ferrell isn't bad in the part. Which is why it's like whiplash when episode 20, Michael's Last Dundies, arrives and D'Angelo is a substantially different character.
You, sir. We're having fun tonight?
Having a great time.
Oh, good.
Thanks,
good.
yeah.
Where were you on September 11th?
No.
In this installment, D'Angelo is an insecure and easily manipulated buffoon. His petty cruelty seems to completely disappear, and he allows Michael to steer him against his will into co-hosting his awkward and often offensive Dundee Awards.
Listen to me. You're not doing this for me. You're not doing this for you. You're not even doing this for them.
What am I doing it for?
Stricken by stage fright, D'Angelo does some dumb but not terribly funny things like read the stage directions off his cue cards. Other than giving Michael someone to lecture to about the importance of the awards, D'Angelo doesn't really serve much purpose in the story. And anyone hoping that D'Angelo's third appearance in the double-sized episode 21, Goodbye Michael, would sort the character out or make his role in the grand scheme of things clear was going to find themselves sorely disappointed. That's because in his third outing, Ferrell seems to be playing yet another version of the character.
Give me that damn dog, you thief! Turn off! Yeah. Don't ever do it again!
This D'Angelo is a recklessly incompetent salesman who seems to be caving into his previously mentioned former habit of overeating. He plays no significant role in Michael's departure, and a final scene in which he seemingly has some sort of food-related breakdown while eating a cake with his hands is never mentioned again.
What am I doing? Come on, D'Angelo.
D'Angelo's final appearance comes in episode 22, The Inner Circle. This time he's back to being mean, except he's a much brasher jerk than he was in his first appearance. And he's also now openly sexist toward the female employees of Dunder Mifflin.
I like Ryan. You seem kind of hysterical to me. Ryan's your supervisor. Let's just leave it that way.
On the other hand, he's also back to being somewhat competent, with even Jim reluctantly acknowledging
he's good at his job, and I like working for him.
Despite this, he extols the virtues of juggling as an executive skill, and then clownishly performs a mime juggling routine set to Evanescence's Bring Me to Life for all his employees. D'Angelo's tenure as regional manager comes to an end when he pulls a basketball hoop down onto himself while showing off his unlikely ability to slam dunk. The whole thing feels totally random, but really, so does everything about D'Angelo. The mean streak, the stage fright, the overeating disorder, the juggling dance, the basketball skills. At the end of 4 episodes, D'Angelo just seems like a string of unrelated gags that even the great Will Ferrell couldn't get big laughs out of. In fact, it's not unreasonable to say that outside his attempts at drama, his run on The Office might be the least funny Ferrell has ever been.
That is cold, sir. Absolutely cold. You know what? It was a complete waste of my time.
And just to be clear, that's not his fault in any way. Ferrell absolutely throws himself into everything he's given to do, from his low-key introduction to the manic dance routines. It's just that nothing he's given to do is really funny. That's because it's pretty obvious that the writers never had a clear vision for D'Angelo's personality or purpose on the show. And as a character-driven comedy, The Office typically draws its laughs by placing the employees of Dunder Mifflin in situations that are personally awkward for them. D'Angelo's character shifts so frequently and so haphazardly, we're never able to form a lasting sense of his personality, what is or isn't awkward for him, or how most of the gang feels about him and his antics, so none of the humor really lands.
Fall asleep right after sex. Huh, guys?
Nope. Go back to the script.
From episode to episode, the writers seem to be searching for his character, trying new and progressively weirder takes. They seem to be searching for better uses for Ferrell's skill set, but the net effect is that D'Angelo just winds up changing into whatever they think they need him to be for any given joke or scene.
They are trying to figure me out, and I don't
like it.
It's not impossible that a character like D'Angelo could have been at the center of some sort of passing of the torch arc that let Michael interact with and maybe even leave an impression on his replacement. What we actually got, however, turned out to be meaningless from a storytelling perspective. And with Ferrell making it clear he wasn't sticking around, there wasn't even any suspense as to whether D'Angelo was there to stay. But really, the worst part of it all was simply that D'Angelo wasted so much time in Carell's final episodes. This is likely because someone assumed the audience would want to see the two comic megastars interact with each other a lot, and that's not unreasonable, but those interactions weren't exceptionally funny, and they ate up time that would have been much better spent letting Michael interact with his office family. Ultimately, it's hard not to think the series wouldn't have been creatively better off simply ending the season with Michael's departure. Season 8 could have led off with the search for a new boss, or even with just a new boss already in place. Sure, some of the material from Ferrell's run has grown on audiences over the years, but at the end of the day, his presence on The Office never felt like much more than a gimmick. And while it's understandable producers would want to do something to boost ratings for Carell's final episodes and give viewers an incentive to keep watching after he left, if your gimmick makes Will Ferrell not funny, maybe it's time for another rewrite.